My name is Ethan Mallory, and I'm about to tell you a story that's been eating at me for months now. I'm 42 years old, live here in Salem, Oregon, and until recently, I thought I knew exactly where I stood in my family. Turns out, I was wrong about everything. To keep listening to this beautiful and special story, please leave your like and subscribe to the channel. Write your name and the city you're watching from so I can include a special shout out to you in a future story here. Let me start with the house. It wasn't just any house. It was a 1920s craftsman that my grandfather built with his own hands when he first moved to Salem from Iowa. Every beam, every window frame, every piece of hardwood flooring was laid by a man who believed in building things to last. When my dad was born, he took his first steps on those floors. When I was born, I did the same. The house sat on Maple Street, with a wraparound porch that caught the morning sun just right, and a basement workshop where 3 generations of Mallory men had fixed everything from bicycles to broken hearts. The smell of sawdust and old wood was as familiar to me as my own reflection. That house wasn't just property, it was our family's DNA written in cedar and stone. After my grandfather passed when I was 12, my dad inherited the place. He was so proud to be the keeper of something that meant so much to our family. Every Sunday, we'd have dinner in that dining room where my grandmother had hosted Christmas for 37 years. Every summer, we'd repaint the shutters the same forest green they'd always been. It was tradition. It was home. Everything changed when I was 20. My mom, Sarah, had been battling cancer for 2 years. I'd moved back into my childhood bedroom to help take care of her, and the house that had always felt so alive suddenly felt like it was holding its breath. I remember the night she passed. It was a Tuesday in March, and the Oregon rain was coming down hard against the windows. My dad and I sat in the living room afterward, neither of us knowing what to say. The house felt too big and too empty all at once. "Your mom loved this place," he said finally, staring at the mantelpiece where her picture still sits. "She always said it was like the house was part of our family." I nodded, unable to speak. Mom had been the one who insisted we keep the original hardwood floors, who'd spent weekends refinishing the kitchen cabinets, who'd planted the rose garden that still blooms every spring. She'd poured herself into that house the same way my grandfather had. For the first year after she died, Dad and I grieved together in that house. We'd sit on the porch in the evenings, not talking much, just listening to the neighborhood settle into night. I'd come by every weekend to help with yard work or fix whatever needed fixing. It was our way of keeping her memory alive, keeping the family tradition going. But grief does funny things to people. And my dad, well, he started getting lonely in ways I couldn't fill. 2 years after Mom died, Dad met Diane at a church social. She was 55, recently divorced, and everything my mother wasn't. Where Mom had been warm and inclusive, Diane was polite but distant. Where Mom had loved the house's history and character, Diane saw outdated fixtures and old-fashioned charm that needed update. The first time Dad brought her to Sunday dinner, I tried to be welcoming. I really did. But sitting at the same table where my mom had served countless meals, watching this stranger critique the dated wallpaper that my grandmother had chosen, it felt like betrayal. "Ethan's been such a help keeping this place running," Dad said, trying to bridge the awkwardness. "He's got his grandfather's hands for fixing things." Diane smiled tightly. "How nice that you have time for that, Ethan. Don't you have your own home to maintain?" The message was clear. I was an intruder in what she already considered her space. I kept my mouth shut and finished my dinner, but something shifted that night. I wasn't just losing my childhood home, I was losing my place in my father's life. When they got married 6 months later, I stood as my dad's best man because that's what sons do. But as I watched him slide a ring onto Diane's finger in the same living room where my parents had renewed their vows 10 years earlier, I felt like I was watching a strange. After the wedding, my visits became increasingly uncomfortable. Diane had moved in completely, and she made it clear that this was her home now. The family photos that had covered the mantelpiece for decades were replaced with her decorative candles. Mom's rose garden was replanted with low-maintenance shrubs. The guest room that had been my childhood bedroom was turned into Diane's craft space. "We need to modernize," she'd say whenever I commented on the changes. "Your father deserves a fresh start." But I kept coming anyway. Every Saturday morning, I'd show up with my toolbox to handle whatever maintenance the house needed. I'd fix the leaky faucet in the upstairs bathroom, replace the weather stripping on the windows, clear the gutters every fall. The house was getting older, and these weren't things Dad could handle on his own anymore. I also quietly started taking over the property taxes. Dad had mentioned they were getting harder to manage on his fixed income, and I figured it was my contribution to keeping the family home in the family. I never made a big deal about it. Just set up automatic payments and kept the receipts. When the furnace died 3 winters ago, I split the replacement cost with Dad. When the roof needed major repairs last year, I handled the whole thing. It wasn't charity, it was I was investing in the place that had made me who I was. But Diane made it clear that my help, while necessary, wasn't exactly welcome. "I don't know why you feel so entitled to be here all the time," she said one Saturday, when I was replacing a broken porch board. "This isn't your house anymore, Ethan." I bit my tongue and kept hammering, but her words stuck with me. "Since when had helping your family become entitlement?" 3 months ago, I was sitting in the kitchen having coffee with my dad, same as I'd done almost every Saturday for the past 14 years. Diane was out shopping, and for once it felt like old times. We were talking about the Blazers season, complaining about the rain, just father and son shooting the breeze. Then, out of nowhere, he said it. I signed the deed over to Diane. I stopped mid-sip. "What do you mean, the house?" I transferred the title to her name. "You don't need the house at your age, and this way she'll have security when I'm gone." I stared at him, the man who had taught me to change a tire, who had shown me how to use every tool in that basement workshop, who had raised me to believe that family meant something, had just casually informed me that I'd been erased from our family's legacy. "When?" I asked. "Last week." "Got it all notarized and filed." "Without telling me?" He shrugged. "Didn't think you'd care that much. You've got your own place." I set down my coffee cup carefully, afraid I might throw it. "Dad, I've been paying the property taxes on this house for over 10 years. I've put thousands of dollars into repairs and improvements. I've spent every Saturday for the past 14 years maintaining this place. And I appreciate that," he said, but his tone suggested he thought I was being dramatic. "But that was your choice. Nobody asked you to do all that." That's when I understood. In his mind, I hadn't been contributing to the family home. I'd been playing house. All those years of investment, all that sweat equity, all those Saturday mornings spent preserving what my grandfather had built. It was just my hobby, my nostalgia, my inability to let go. I drove home that day, feeling like I'd been punched in the gut, but as the shock wore off, something else took its place. A cold, calculating anger. I'd been dismissed as sentimental, but I'm also my grandfather's grandson, and my grandfather had taught me to keep record. That evening, I went to my home office and pulled out the filing cabinet I'd maintained for years. Inside were folder after folder of documentation, property tax payments dating back to 2003, and receipts for every major repair and improvement I'd funded. Contracts with roofing companies, HVAC specialists, and electricians, bank statements showing regular transfers to cover house expenses. I spread it all out on my dining room table and started calculating. Over the past 10 years, I had contributed more than $60,000 to that house. $60,000 in taxes, repairs and improvements. Not gifts, not charity, equity. I also found something else. The original deed from when my grandfather had left the house to my dad. It specifically mentioned that the property was being passed down to preserve the family legacy for future generations. Granddad had intended for that house to stay in the family, all of the family. Monday morning, I called Jake Morrison, a real estate attorney I'd gone to high school with. I hadn't spoken to him in years, but when I explained the situation, he agreed to meet with me that afternoon. "This is interesting," he said after reviewing my documentation. "You've essentially been a co-owner in everything but name. The equity you've built up in this property is substantial. What are my options?" "Well, you could file a claim for unjust enrichment. You could also challenge the transfer based on lack of disclosure about your financial contributions. Or," he paused, thinking, "we could request mediation. Give them a chance to acknowledge your stake and work out a fair agreement." I chose mediation. I wasn't trying to steal anyone's house. I just wanted recognition that I wasn't some outsider trying to horn in on someone else's property. This was my family's home, and I had earned my place in it. 3 weeks later, Diane received a certified letter requesting mediation over undisclosed equity contributions. Jake had kept the language formal, but clear. I was claiming a financial stake in the property based on my documented contributions over the past decade. My phone rang within an hour of the letter being delivered. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" My dad's voice was shaking with rage. I let the call go to voicemail. Then I sat in my living room and listened to him tear into me for 5 straight minutes. I was ungrateful. I was greedy. I was trying to steal from my stepmother. I was a disappointment. When he was finished, I played the message again and again because I needed to hear it. Needed to understand that the man yelling at me wasn't the same man who had taught me to respect family, to honor commitments, to do right by the people you love. That man had raised me to believe that actions have consequences, that you can't just take from people without acknowledging what you owe them. But apparently those lessons only applied when it was convenient. I didn't call him back. Instead, I drove to the house I'd been caring for every Saturday for 14 years, and sat in my car across the street. I looked at the porch I'd repaired, the shutters I'd painted, the roof I'd replaced. I thought about my grandfather's hands shaping those original boards, my mother's laughter echoing through those rooms, my own childhood spent in every corner of that building. And I realized something. I wasn't fighting for a house, I was fighting for the right to exist in my own family story. The mediation process put a legal hold on the property transfer. Until our dispute was resolved, the title couldn't be finalized in Diane's name. She was furious. Dad was furious. I was oddly calm. For the first time in months, I felt like I had some control over my own life. I wasn't the desperate son begging for scraps of attention. I wasn't the unwanted visitor overstaying his welcome. I was a man with legal standing, documented contributions, and legitimate claims. Jake walked me through what to expect. "They'll probably offer you a cash settlement," he said. "Something to make you go away without admitting fault." "I don't want cash," I told him. "I want recognition. I want acknowledgement that I'm part of this family and that my contributions matter." "That's going to be harder," he warned. "Pride is expensive." He was right. The first offer came 2 weeks later. $15,000 and a promise that I could visit the house twice a year. I laughed when Jake read it to me. $15,000 for a decade of Saturday mornings. For $60,000 in actual contributions. For being written out of my own family legacy. I declined. The second offer was $25,000. I declined that too. Meanwhile, my dad stopped talking to me entirely. When I drove by the house, I could see him working in the yard, but he wouldn't look in my direction. Diane had apparently convinced him that I was trying to destroy their marriage, steal their security, and ruin their golden years. Maybe but they'd started it when they decided I didn't matter enough to include in decisions about my own family's heritage. The breakthrough came during our first official mediation session. Jake had prepared a detailed presentation of my financial contributions, complete with receipts, canceled checks, and photographic evidence of improvements I'd made. But the mediator, a patient woman named Carol Williams, wanted to hear from everyone involved. "Ethan," she said, "can you explain what this house means to you?" I talked about my grandfather's hands, my mother's love, the Saturday morning spent preserving something precious. I talked about tradition, about legacy, about the responsibility I felt to keep something beautiful alive for future generations. "Diane," Carol said next, "what is your perspective on this situation?" Diane spoke about security, about her right to feel safe in her own home, about not wanting to be beholden to a stepson who might decide to kick her out whenever he felt like it. "And Richard," Carol said to my dad, "what was your intention when you transferred the deed?" That's when the truth came out. My dad admitted that he'd been feeling guilty about my contributions for years. He knew I'd been paying the taxes, knew I'd been covering repairs, knew I'd been treating the house like it was partially mine. But instead of talking to me about it, instead of finding a way to acknowledge my stake formally, he decided to eliminate the problem by giving the house to someone else entirely. "I thought if I just signed it over to Diane, all the complications would go away," he said. "Ethan would have to accept that it wasn't his house anymore, and we could all move on." The mediator looked at him for a long moment. "Mr. Mallory, when someone contributes significantly to a property's maintenance and value, those contributions create legal obligations. You can't make those obligations disappear by transferring the property to someone else." That's when I saw it in my dad's eyes. The realization that he'd made a terrible mistake, not just legally, but morally. He'd tried to erase me from the family story, And instead, he'd created a legal mess that was going to force all of us to confront the truth. The mediation took 3 sessions, but eventually we reached an agreement. The house would remain in my dad's name during his lifetime, but the deed would be amended to reflect my financial contributions. Upon his death, I would inherit a percentage of the property equivalent to my equity stake, roughly 30%, and Diane would inherit the. More importantly, I would be granted formal access rights. I could continue my Saturday maintenance routine, could visit whenever I wanted, could bring my own future family to the house where I'd grown up. I wasn't just a guest anymore. I was a legal stakeholder. Diane wasn't happy about it, but she accepted the agreement. My dad signed the papers quietly, avoiding eye contact with everyone in the room. But that's not the end of the story, because after we left the mediator's office, my dad asked if we could grab coffee. Just the two of us. We sat in a diner on Commercial Street, the same place where he'd taken me for milkshakes when I was 10 years old. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Finally he said, "I'm sorry, son. I handled this all wrong." I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw an old man who'd been scared of dying and leaving loose ends, who'd been pressured by a new wife to cut ties with his old life, who'd convinced himself that erasing complications was easier than dealing with them. "I know, Dad," I said. "I'm sorry too, for the lawyers, for the legal mess, for not just talking to you about this years ago." "No," he said. "You did what you had to do. I taught you to stand up for yourself, and then I got angry when you did it. That's not fair." We sat there for another hour, talking about Mom, about Granddad, about the house and what it meant to both of us. For the first time in years, I felt like I was talking to my father instead of Diane's husband. When we got ready to leave, he asked, "Will you still come by on Saturday?" "If you want me to," I said. "I do," he said. "The house needs you."